Good morning, everyone. Thank you for braving the torrential storms last night and joining us this morning. Good morning and welcome to CSIS. My name is Victor Cha. I'm the Senior Advisor and Korea Chair here at CSIS and Professor at Georgetown University. We want to welcome you all to the 6th Annual Jungang-ilbo CSIS Forum, and the first forum actually that's taking place here in Washington, D.C. And so CSIS is very happy to be able to participate in the forum here in Washington, D.C. We want to acknowledge the groups that have helped us to put on the conference this morning. That is, of course, Jungang-ilbo, Samsung, and CSIS. I will introduce our president in a moment. However, before beginning, I want to share with all of you our building safety precautions. Overall, we feel secure in our facility here, but as a convener, we have a duty to prepare for an eventuality. And if that were the case, CSIS staff here will serve as your responsible safety officers during the event. You will follow their instructions if there is ever a need that arises. And please take a moment to familiarize yourself with the emergency exits for this room, which are the glass doors behind you, as well as the doors behind the stage. But this is going to be, I think, a very interesting day, certainly a very timely discussion with regard to Korea and East Asia and U.S. policy. And to start us off, both the President and CEO, John Hamre, and Chairman Hong Seok-hyun will be giving some opening remarks. So I will give the stage now to President Hamre.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome. We're delighted to have you here, and let me say welcome and thank you to Dr. Hong, his colleagues. Dr. Hong's also my boss. I mean, he's on the board of CSIS, and when he said, I think we should do the Jungang-ilbo CSIS Forum in Washington this year, I said, yes, sir, we will do that. But I'm very glad to have a chance to do that. You know, first of all, it provides some welcome relief from the substance-free campaign we're having in America. You know, this is pretty dismal. But we're able to put ideas in front of the American public, and I'm very glad that you're giving us this opportunity, Dr. Hong. We had a fascinating discussion last night over dinner. The speakers were together, and Professor Moon, as we were going to be moderating a session later, he wrote in a very interesting essay the 5 potential scenarios for Korea going forward. Get closer to the United States to be able to stand up to China, get closer to China, you know, muddle through with the way we are now. I can't remember the 4th one, and I remember the 5th one was Korea should stand up and be a leader to create a new regional architecture. And this was a very interesting group that Dr. Hong had organized, taking 30 plus intellectuals to China to go along the border between China and North Korea. And 30 out of 32 of these intellectuals voted for scenario number 5. And of course, I think that Korea should chart its own trajectory going forward. But I think this is probably a conversation we ought to have together. I remember when Secretary Rumsfeld about 15 years ago just unilaterally said we're going to transfer wartime operational control to the Koreans, and it set off tidal wave, you know, in Korea. Is America abandoning Korea? I think we're inextricably tied to each other to think through this together. It's Korea's trajectory in Northeast Asia is essential to America's security. And I would argue that the partnership with America is essential for Korea to find its own trajectory. Dr. Hong and I had this conversation last night as we were leaving. I love Korea. I have a Korean godson. I'm deeply emotionally committed to Korea. But Korea does not think of itself as a global leader. It thinks of itself as a middle power. It doesn't think of itself as being the grand architect of a regional security structure. It thinks of itself as a broker of its own interests caught between two giant countries. You know, and if Korea is going to be the architect of its future, I think it means it has to be in partnership with us. And I think we have to be confident enough that Korea's wise judgment about its own self-interest is hugely parallel to our own interests. I do not think we're on a collision course. There were times in our history together where we were pulling in different directions. That's not the case now. I think there's a great deal of mutually reinforcing conviction about our interests, your interests, and how they reinforce each other. But there are so many questions we have to think through together. What is the prospect for unification? How will that happen? What role do we play when unification comes? What will be the conditions of unification that will be acceptable to the Chinese? And do we understand together what those might be? What larger role is Korea willing to play on the international stage? It's the 9th largest economy in the world. It's time for Korea to be playing a much larger role in the international community in dealing with global public goods. What would those be? How would we do that together? I mean, we have so many questions that we really should be resolving to deliberate together. And I think that's the purpose of this day. And I think this is going to be an enormously productive conference, and I'm grateful for Victor Cha for the work he's done to pull it together, my Korean friends and colleagues who've come a very long way to give us their very enormous contributions for this conversation, and especially to you, Dr. Hong. There aren't many businessmen in my professional life that I've met of his character. He's obviously a very successful businessman, but he's also spent a considerable portion of his life dedicated to public service. I first met him in 2005 when Dr. Hong was Korea's ambassador here in Washington, and he did a superb job back then. And those were not as easy days. Those were some challenging days. And he took back with him after he returned to Korea a conviction of his responsibility, not as a business leader, but as a national leader, to carry Korea to a larger consciousness about its own future and how to manage that future. So I'm very grateful that we have him with us today. And could I ask you, with your warm applause, welcome Seok-Kyung Hong, Dr. Hong.
Well, good morning, everybody. First of all, let me thank John Hamney, my dear friend, for your kind words on myself, and but more importantly, on the role of Korea in the coming years, not only in Northeast Asia and focused on the peninsula, but our role on the world peace, I think, because Asia is going to be a most important region in the world. And I think the thesis just you proposed, I take of it as our future homework, which my friends and compatriots should all work on, how to achieve that challenges and take those challenges as our own task. I think that's a very important thing for us to really study over the years. But let me come back to my prepared speech. It is indeed a great honor and pleasure to have the Jungang-ilbo CSIS Forum in Washington at this momentous time. And we are very honored to have Assistant Secretary Dan Russell with us this morning. And I would also like to thank former Minister Kim Tae-yong, my friend from high school days, for being a member of the delegation from Seoul. My thanks also to J.D. Crouch, Robert Einan, Kurt Campbell, and Wendy Sherman, as well as Ambassador Mark Lippert and Ambassador An Ho-young for agreeing to speak at this forum, during what I believe is a very momentous time. I would also like to extend my deep gratitude to CSIS President and CEO John Hamre and everyone here for putting this event together for the first time in Washington, D.C. We greatly appreciate the warm welcome you have shown to our delegation. And all my thanks to all of you who have taken the time to join today's forum. Your presence here increases our impact and assures that we can have a positive influence on policy. On the plane here from Seoul, I had the time to reflect on the political backdrop for this year's forum and consider the historical context of this gathering. I came to the conclusion that we are facing a very serious challenge, and I want to make sure that the true significance of these events is clear from the start. Firstly, North Korea has evidently entered into a classical provocation mode. We kicked off this year with North Korea's fourth nuclear test, followed by its launch of a long-range missile. These actions signal to the world that Kim Jong-un regime is unafraid and will pursue a brazen course of provocation. North Korea has avoided denuclearization talks. The strategy seems to be constant provocations, punctuated by occasional demands for negotiations for some sort of a peace agreement. Although the pattern is familiar to all long-term Korea hands, the behavior of Pyongyang this time is the most vicious yet. We have stepped outside the realm of the predictable. Secondly, I'm also profoundly concerned by the lack of cooperation among the 5 parties to the 6-party talks with North Korea: the United States, China, South Korea, Russia, and Japan. It was extremely important that the international community issued a strong Security Council resolution against North Korea's acts of provocation. But such statements are only as good as their actual implementation. We must wait and see what is actually done. What I can say with confidence is that as long as friction dominates diplomatic relations among the United States, China, Russia, and Japan, vital collaboration will be limited. As long as the nations of the region see each other as competitors, the vision for a peaceful future will remain out of grasp. If a larger culture of international cooperation is missing, North Korea will find it easier to play the various members of the 6-party talks off each other. Sadly, we see China and Russia putting their geopolitical interests above the resolution of North Korea's nuclear issue. However, Chinese President Xi Jinping is strong warning to Pyongyang during last week's April 28th CICA, the Conference of Asian Foreign Ministers, that China will fully implement sanctions against North Korea and that it will not permit war or chaos on the peninsula is an encouraging development. Thirdly, South Korea and the United States should not let these tremendous challenges lead them to lose sight of their roadmap towards a peaceful future and a concrete proposal for a peace agreement. An agreement on the potential for a peace treaty with North Korea in the future and for a roadmap for reunification will assure that Seoul and Washington remain on the same page and that cooperation among the 5 nations is constructive and focused on essential issues. If South Korea and the U.S. do not see eye to eye and embrace a long-term vision, differences could profoundly complicate future developments and undermine the potential for current efforts to bring about a permanent solution. And lastly, we must remember that the current lead up to presidential elections in both South Korea and the U.S. may complicate our efforts. Regardless of the outcomes in both countries, we will witness a significant transition in power in Washington as well as in Seoul. The National Assembly elections last month in Korea have already altered the political landscape, and we need to look at the debate on North Korea policy in the context of next year's presidential election in South Korea. The presidential campaign in the United States may also complicate the process. Now that I have described the backdrop for this year's forum, let me tell you how much I'm looking forward to the discussions today. To get you started and to add a bit of firepower to the debate, let me first share a few of my thoughts regarding the environment we find ourselves in now. If we consider the current political environment, the first task is how best to apply pressure and implement sanctions on North Korea while strengthening cooperation among the other 5 countries in the 6-party talks. We have seen in past cases how such actions have resulted in deepening differences between the parties and even leading to open dissent when we should be forming a consensus. I believe the risks are very high this time, and we need to handle this matter very carefully. Secondly, we need to explore ways to gain momentum in the dialogue with North Korea and engage in substantial negotiation, while at the same time applying pressure on North Korea. At present, we have no option but to pressure North Korea. At the same time, we must see that there will be no way forward toward resolution if there is no available track for dialogue and negotiations. We need to carefully consider the conditions under which we should switch to a negotiation track. Thirdly, we need to know in advance how we'll move forward when negotiations do resume. I believe we need to think about creative and bold measures that can turn the current crisis into an unprecedented opportunity to negotiate an end to the nuclear issue. We have all the players on the same page, and we are applying pressure together. We have to make it clear to North Korea that we are agreed on the solution as well. Many have spoken out about the importance of a peace treaty. The peace treaty issue is an extremely sensitive and difficult issue, but we do need to have an agreement as to what it would mean. Let me share with you my very basic thoughts on this matter. I believe it is essential that discussions regarding a peace agreement should neither cause a rift between South Korea and the U.S., nor allow other parties to use that topic for their own geopolitical gain. The important point is that discussions about denuclearization and a peace agreement should be complementary and should not hinder each other. It would be a grave mistake if misguided talks regarding a peace treaty or a peace regime, if you like, ended up overshadowing discussions on denuclearization. In his talks with Secretary of State John Kerry, Chinese Minister of Foreign Affairs Wang Yi floated the idea of discussions on a peace treaty in parallel with denuclearization of North Korea. Such a peace treaty could serve as a component of a final resolution of the nuclear issue. In this regard, we should be wary of the expected insistence by Pyongyang that it must hold only bilateral talks with Washington. I feel it is imperative that Seoul play a key role in any discussion. In fact, Seoul is best positioned to assure that we can pursue both talks on denuclearization and move towards a peace treaty. Fourthly, all of these activities need to be carried out in full understanding that there will be a power transition period in both South Korea and the United States. That transition poses challenges in terms of implementation of agreements and assurance of continuity. We remember the problems that resulted because of a lack of coordination between the Bill Clinton and the George W. Bush administrations on North Korean agreements. Seoul and Washington have to make sure they are in close consultation regarding policy during this time of change, so as to assure close cooperation and coordinated measures between the new administrations. Looking at North Korea's pattern of behavior and the Kim Jong-un regime's track record, it is likely that North Korea will be engaged in outrageously provocative acts around the time of the launch of the new administration in the U.S. in an effort to sow confusion and division between Seoul and Washington. That said, the transitions in our two capitals could also be an opportunity for a true diplomatic breakthrough. Perhaps the Obama and Park administration could be convinced to see such a breakthrough as an opportunity to establish their historical legacy and deflect criticism that their North Korea policies were not effective. We will have a chance today to discuss how developments in North Korea, in the region, and in the alliance dynamics are linked to the developments that I have shared with you. I'm very much looking forward to listening to today's panels. I would like to urge the experts gathered here today to pull their wisdom together and to speak frankly. I'm certain they will be able to find real answers to the vexing problems I have mentioned in your presentations and your comments today. Once again, my deepest appreciation to President John Henry for hosting this year's 중앙일보 CSIS Forum, and to you all for being here. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Hong and President Hamry, for starting us off. We will move directly to our keynote address by Danny Russell. Let me properly introduce him to you. The Honorable Daniel Russell is the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs and is a career member of the Senior Foreign Service at the State Department. Prior to his appointment as Assistant Secretary in 2013, Mr. Russell served as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director of East Asian Affairs in the National Security Council. He was Director of the State Department Office of Japanese Affairs until January 2009. Mr. Russell served as the U.S. Consul General in Osaka, Kobe, Japan from 2005 to 2008, Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in The Hague, Netherlands from 2002 to 2005, and the U.S. Embassy in Cyprus from 1999 to 2002. He has a wealth of experience not just on Asia but also on Korea, and it has worked on previous agreements with both South Korea and with North Korea. He received the State Department's Director General Award for reporting. He's also author of America's Place in the World and is a graduate of Sarah Lawrence College and University College, University of London. So with great pleasure, I'm happy to introduce to you Assistant Secretary Danny Russell.
Good morning, and thank you very much, Victor, for the introduction. I'm delighted to be here at CSIS, and especially delighted to be here with so many very good, very old friends, and some great Korea hands. It's also an honor to be the warm-up act for Rich Armitage and Wendy Sherman, who will be your speakers, I know, at lunchtime. So, there's always a lot to discuss when it comes to North Korea. But this conference on the Korean Peninsula is particularly timely given the impending North Korea Workers' Party conference, which starts later this week, given the also the tempo of DPRK provocations. It's a great time to be a North Korea analyst or a policymaker. It's probably not such a good time to be a Musudan rocket engineer or project manager, but that's another story. So today you're going to be wrestling with questions about the Korean paradigm, about the framework for dealing with the challenges on the Korean Peninsula. So I think what might be helpful for me would be to lay out the elements of our Korea policy, what we've been doing, what have the constants been, what are we doing now, what are we working towards. And I want to begin by stressing 2 points. First, dealing with North Korea is only a fraction of our strong and important and flourishing relationship with the Republic of Korea. And I'm confident that you will hear more about that and more specifics about that from Ambassador Lippert, I'm sure, who's going to address you later. Second, we're addressing the challenges posed by North Korea's bad choices in the context of very important shifts in the regional dynamic. Beijing's trade and political relations have grown dramatically with Seoul, and just as dramatically have atrophied with Pyongyang. Clearly, China's frustration with North Korea has grown very significantly. And at the same time, security and now political cooperation between Seoul and Tokyo and trilaterally with Washington has begun to grow at a very rapid pace. Now, speaking from my own experience from within the National Security Council, within the State Department, I can attest that recent administrations, including this one, have all conducted thorough North Korea policy reviews. We have unpacked America's strategic priorities and guiding principles. We've rigorously examined them. We've taken a close look at what we're hearing from our partners. We've analyzed the signals that we're getting from the North Koreans. We analyzed also our own assumptions about the North Koreans, and we asked ourselves, what are we missing? But having done all that, we put together options, we've developed strategies, and we've presented them on how to deal with the Korean Peninsula. And it's worth pointing out that this is a very pragmatic administration. President Obama clearly hasn't been hamstrung by ideological baggage in dealing with foreign policy challenges. You've seen this in his approach to Burma, Myanmar, to Iran, to Cuba. And it's equally true with respect to North Korea. There's been no lack of imagination or creativity on our part. There's been no lack of effort either. So, why hasn't U.S. North Korea policy changed? Why hasn't it shifted? Well, there are two reasons. One is simply that North Korea has not given us an opening. I'm not counting propaganda. This business about let's talk about getting U.S. forces out of Korea and let's halt alliance exercises, that's not serious. I'm talking about credible engagement on the real problem areas. North Korea has not given us an opening. But secondly, our policies haven't shifted because the bedrock principles that have shaped North Korea policy under this and previous administrations are solid, and they've been proven to be solid. And what are they? Well, first and foremost, we will protect the United States, we will protect our allies by seeking a nuclear weapons-free Korean peninsula. We will not accept North Korea as a nuclear state or willingly weaken the global non-proliferation regime that's made all of humanity safer. Next, we are committed to preventing war and defending our allies. Our extended deterrence and our commitments to the Republic of Korea and to Japan are ironclad. Third, we support the peaceful reunification of the Korean Peninsula. And in the meantime, we seek a better life for all the Korean people. That's why we've tried to reduce the suffering of the North Korean people where we can and expose the serious violations of human rights that we can't prevent. Fourth, we will always work with our partners. Now, although we never refuse to communicate directly with the DPRK, we recognize that its actions are a regional problem, are a global problem, not simply a bilateral matter between the U.S. and North Korea. We will always keep faith with the Republic of Korea, with our allies. We will always consult closely with our six-party partners. And we will work through the UN Security Council and the UN's specialized agencies. Fifth, we won't make the same mistakes over and over again. Or as Bob Gates famously put it, we won't buy the same horse twice. Maybe it was 3 times. All of the commitments that we've made, all of the concessions that we've offered through the six-party talks remain on the table. But neither we nor our partners are now willing to take North Korea's promises at face value. We need to see meaningful action to comply with its obligations before North Korea can get the relief or the benefits that it's asking for. So the consistency of our approach and the continuity of policy from administration to administration reflects the constancy of these principles and judgments, not any lack of effort or enterprise. So our current policy is built on and very much reflects the hard work and the experience of our predecessors. The agreed framework reached by Bob Gallucci in 1994, which Bob Garland played an important role. That's an agreement that froze North Korea's plutonium program for 8 years. The work that Bob Einhorn and Wendy Sherman did at the end of the Clinton administration, the tireless work of my predecessor, Chris Hill, and my colleague, Sung Kim, when they worked in the Bush administration. So in the landmark joint statement of the six-party talks in 2005, North Korea committed to abandon its nuclear programs. But 3 years later, it declared the six-party talks dead, and it walked out. And when the next president, Barack Obama, offered to extend a hand to those who would unclench their fist, North Korea conducted a ballistic missile test under the guise of a satellite launch, and then set off its second nuclear detonation. Ever since then, our response hasn't lacked in flexibility, but despite the best efforts by the U.S. and our partners, today we face a leader in North Korea who seems unwilling even to utter the word denuclearization. So what are those best efforts that I talked about? Well, I've told you that in addressing North Korea's provocations, we've been true to our principles. But at the same time, we've been active and creative in the many different ways we've tried to twist the Rubik's Cube. We have pursued and we continue to pursue engagement with the North. When he took office, President Obama recruited a top-flight diplomat well known to all of you, the late, great Ambassador Steve Bosworth, to serve as special representative for North Korea. Ambassador Sung Kim and I accompanied Steve to Pyongyang in 2009 to meet with Kang Suk-ju, Kim Gae-gwan, very senior North Korean officials, other leaders. And we did everything that we could on that trip to open the door, to encourage and to test Pyongyang's willingness to engage, willingness to start back down the path of denuclearization and negotiations. What was the response? Well, as you say in Korean, bupkis. I think that's Korean anyway. Nothing. But we've kept the door open. And we have engaged with different DPRK officials in different places. We've conducted face-to-face talks. We've talked in full view of the media. We've talked behind closed doors. We've supported Track 2 efforts. We've supported exchanges. We've tried bilateral, trilateral, multilateral efforts. We have spelled out in detail the assistance and the support that we could offer on the road to denuclearization if North Korea lived up to its agreements. We've reaffirmed that the commitments that we made in the 2005 joint statement remain solid, remain on the table. But no matter how we've twisted that Rubik's Cube, Pyongyang has held stubbornly to its dogma. America's alliance with the ROK constitutes a hostile policy, and that justifies Pyongyang's nuclear and missile programs. QED, there's nothing to talk about. So part of our answer has been to strengthen our coordination with the Republic of Korea. We've sent 2 great ambassadors, Sung Kim, the first Korean American to represent the president in Seoul, and Mark Lippert, the president's long trusted advisor. Part of our answer has been to send some of America's best warfighting generals to U.S. Forces Korea. And we've updated key components of the alliance for the security wonks here, the Special Measures Agreement and the OPCON transfer timeline. We've completed the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement, and Seoul has expressed great interest in the TPP. We've opened new frontiers of cooperation on areas from climate change and disaster relief to cyberspace and outer space policy. Polls show that the Korean people's support for the alliance is at a historic high. And importantly, the North has found no daylight between us. But there's a lot more to our strategy. Our ability to share information and coordinate trilaterally with Seoul and Tokyo has been transformed by the landmark agreement reached by President Park and Prime Minister Abe on December 28th of last year. We've also intensified our cooperation with China on North Korea. Beijing's frustration with Pyongyang's irresponsible and risky behavior is palpable, and can you blame them? North Korea's wanton disregard for China's legitimate interests, not merely for those of the international community, but for China's interests, has enabled us to find important common ground with Beijing. And we worked closely with Chinese diplomats at the UN to pass UN Security Council Resolution 2270. Now, as I look around, I see at least two thought bubbles forming over people's heads. One is, yeah, is China going to really enforce those sanctions? And the other is, oh, you got another UN Security Council resolution. Big deal. Okay. It's too early to assess Chinese enforcement, but the Chinese leaders are saying that they fully intend to fully implement Resolution 2270. And we're seeing some important signs of follow-through, including announcements of new trade restrictions and inspections. But I admit time will tell just how real and just how sustained this all is. What about 22.7? Is it just more of the same? I don't think so. My contention is that we have never really tried this level of pressure before. 2270 is a major tightening of the international web of sanctions that constrict the DPRK. And the global adherence to the terms of these sanctions is also unprecedented. Countries are not cutting North Korea any slack anymore. Moreover, the sanctions don't only target the prohibited nuclear and ballistic missile activities of North Korea, they shut down the commercial and the diplomatic activities that Pyongyang uses to fund and to supply and to conceal those activities. So global sanctions now deny them rocket parts, deny them hard currency. Global sanctions make it much more difficult for North Korea to build new missiles or nuclear weapons. And exclusion from the international banking system and the transportation network makes it harder and harder and harder for North Korea to fund its programs. The lack of hard currency drives the growth of a domestic black market that's independent of central state control. And the shortfall of cash means there's that much less money to spend on the army, on the secret police, on bribing the senior party cadre with Mercedes and Rolexes, and of course that much less money to spend on missiles and on nuclear warheads. So in a sense, yeah, this is a policy of attrition. But here's an important point. These sanctions are designed to bring North Korea to its senses, not to its knees. We're not out to crush the DPRK. But what about this theory of a cornered rat, of North Korea lashing out? Well, there are two very important elements of our policy, our strategy, that directly address that risk. The first is deterrence. Our alliance with the ROK has simply never been stronger. And in response to the growing ballistic missile threat, we've begun formal consultations on potentially deploying a top missile system called THAAD. And despite all the saber rattling from Pyongyang, I do not think that North Korea is under any illusions about American resolve or the consequences of an attack. The second element is diplomacy. We continue to make clear, privately and publicly, that the pathway is open to North Korea to achieve lasting security through credible and authentic negotiations. And that's not just a catchphrase. Now, North Korea is surrounded by three of the largest and most successful economies on planet Earth. And these countries, along with the United States, will continue to grow richer, continue to grow stronger, continue to grow together. North Korea is living on borrowed time. So we have made clear to Pyongyang that the pathway to a prosperous future and to the security that it seeks is open, but that the gateway remains through denuclearization, through negotiations. But North Korea won't reaffirm its commitment to complete denuclearization, something they agreed to in 2005. And if the North Koreans won't even do that, how serious can they be? Now, beforehand, let me just mention one very serious concern that I know was taken up in a separate program yesterday here at CSIS, although it's not on your agenda, North Korea's systemic human rights abuses. The groundbreaking findings of the UN Commission of Inquiry have shown what many of us suspected, but most countries have been reluctant to address. The egregious pattern of human rights violations in North Korea. And in response, the UN General Assembly and the Human Rights Council have passed resolutions. And in response, the U.S., for our part, have established sanctions authorities to hold the human rights abusers and the regime accountable. The systematic oppression of the North Korean people, which is appalling in its own right, serves to widen the gap between North and South and to complicate the already formidable challenges of reintegration. So we have both a moral obligation and a strategic interest in shining a spotlight on the oppression and on working for accountability. So Dr. Hamri, Ambassador Hong, CSIS, and Chugang Ilbo have really an extraordinary lineup of talented panelists today. So the sooner I wrap up, the sooner you can get started. And I very much sincerely look forward to hearing the results of your conference. And with Victor, I'm happy in the remaining time to answer any questions that folks may have. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Danny. That was great. That was fantastic explanation of the policy and the rationale behind the policy. We do have time for a couple of questions, if that's okay
Sure.
with you. So if anybody in the audience has a question, please just raise your hand and introduce yourself. And given the limited amount of time, we'd like a question, not a statement, if at all possible.
I see some.
Yes. I couldn't see from over there.
Florence Lowley from Global America Business Institute. During your talk, you mentioned about North Korea coming up with a meaningful action. Other than giving up a nuclear weapons program, what other actions do you consider meaningful?
Well, we're engaged in an effort to bring about peaceful change in North Korea, focused on, first and foremost, the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, which is something that North Korea has in the past committed to. The only pathway we see that's viable is negotiations. But having walked out of the six-party talk, North Korea has posed a real challenge to all of us. How do we negotiate? And I described in my remarks the experimentation that we've undertaken over the years. It's dangerous to set very specific hurdles that North Korea has to clear in order for us to be willing to sit down. We definitely do not want to be led astray, taken off, as Ambassador Hong was mentioning, into the dark alley of discussions of a peace treaty. That's a long way off. We want the focus to be on denuclearization. So there are a few common sense benchmarks that we have consistently applied. As I said, if North Korea won't even use the word denuclearization, are they really willing to negotiate? If North Korea won't own up to its own commitments, not Security Council resolutions that were imposed on them, commitments that North Korea willingly undertook in an open negotiating process, fully to denuclearize, can they be serious? If North Korea won't even freeze its nuclear and its missile program, if it's going to continue to launch ballistic missiles and conduct nuclear tests in overt defiance of the UN Security Council resolution, can it be serious? We know what it looks like. There are many people in this room who have had the experience of dealing with a North Korea that was prepared to negotiate. That's not where North Korea is today. But the intent of sanctions and the rigorous application of sanctions is to convince North Korea's leaders that they have no viable alternative to a peaceful, negotiated way forward. No one I know believes that North Korea is going to begin by fully denuclearizing, but that is where the process is going to have to end.
Can I ask you a question on the human rights piece that you mentioned at the end? As you referred to in your speech, CSIS hosted yesterday the first trilateral meeting of the 3 human rights ambassadors from the United States, Japan, and South Korea. Mike Green, the Japan chair, and myself hosted that. As part of this new set of sanctions that the United States has imposed, there's a provision for actually sanctioning people who are responsible for human rights abuses. Do you see that as happening? Do you see that as being an authority that this administration will exercise?
The reason that that provision is in the executive order is to make it possible for us, first, to develop the evidence, and second, to act on it. The principle of accountability is a feature of UN Security Council Resolution 2270 as well. And we see just last month the adoption of the resolution by consensus in Geneva by the Human Rights Council. I think that the prospect of officials being held to account for systemic abuses of universal human rights is a serious one. And that is one way in which we and the international community can keep faith with the North Korean people. I believe that the day will come when, as happened elsewhere in the world, the people of North Korea, eventually liberated, are going to ask who stood by them. And it is our firm intent to be numbered among them.
Right. Thank you. Let's go to Chris Nelson and then Stanley Roth. If we can keep your questions short.
Always. Thanks. Chris Nelson, Nelson Report. 2 short questions. Mr. Secretary, thanks for a great speech. Got a couple of good sound bites out of it. When we talk about close coordination with Washington and Seoul on the future of the Korean Peninsula, don't we need to talk about close coordination with Washington, Seoul, and Beijing in a way that brings the Chinese into it with us rather than, oh, it's us versus them? Number one. Number two, last week in this perpetual wonderful Groundhog Day conversation that we have at the Asan Plenum in Seoul, Gary Seymour, your previous colleague on the NSC, was of the view that the sanctions process obviously needs to be vastly implemented and strengthened. It will be, but he thought that we have time to have it take effect, that the perfection of an ICBM, of a reentry vehicle, et cetera, is at least months and probably years away. so we don't have to have immediate Iran-level sanctions right now. Do you agree with that assessment, or is this sense that that the time is against us and we need to have even stronger sanctions than what we've been talking about before? So thank you.
Well, coordinating with our closest partner, the ROK, on the future of the Korean Peninsula is a priority, but it's not an exclusive undertaking. We coordinate bilaterally with the Chinese and multilaterally, for that matter. There's a constant engagement among the 5 parties. And President Park herself has proposed convening the 5-party as its own process, which is certainly an idea worth considering. The question of the progression of the North Korean ICBM program is best left to the experts. I'm not actually a rocket scientist, but the fact of the matter is that no president of the United States has the luxury of hoping that the reality comports closer to the rosy scenario than to the grim one. We believe that concerted and robust efforts are needed not only by the United States, but by the countries in the region and by the international community to move in the ways that we judge will be most effective to deter, to mitigate, and to end the threat posed by North Korea's active pursuit of a ICBM, not to mention a nuclear-armed ICBM capability.
Great. We have time for one more. Stanley.
Mine was so similar on that.
Okay. Myung-Bok-jae. Wait for the mic. Wait for the microphone.
중앙일보.
Yeah.
My name is Bae Myung-bok from 중앙일보. Mrs. Assistant Secretary, recently in an interview with Western media, for example, Reuters, I remember, you mentioned about defense-related measures in case of the North's 5th nuclear test. What do you mean by that?
Well, the defense of the Republic of Korea and of Japan, as well as the defense of the American homeland, is priority number 1 for President Obama, for any president of the United States. It's a matter of straightforward logic that we continue to upgrade our deterrence and our defensive measures, both in strategy and equipment and in technology, in order to adapt to and account for any progress by North Korea in its ability to threaten us with missiles or with potentially nuclear weapons. So I'm not the person to speak to the specifics of the U.S. alliance. Ambassador Lippert can address that, as can, I'm sure, General Crouch. But as a key component of our strategy, we will not allow the threat from North Korea, either to our allies or to ourselves, to grow without taking appropriate compensating and deterrent measures.
Well, Dan, you said you're not a rocket scientist, and that's right. You're a great diplomat, but you're probably better than the rocket scientists in North Korea these days.
Well, I wonder how they're doing.
Right. Anyway, thank you for taking some time with us this morning. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Please, let's thank Dan.